to give a compliments, and then I'll talk a little more from notes and maybe a bit more interactively near the end. So on a cold January evening in 1919, a group of left-leaning German students gathered in a bookstore in Munich to listen to a talk by the sociologist Max Weber. Only 2 months earlier, Germany had suffered defeat in the First World War, and Germany's political situation was at least as cold and bleak and dark as the night outside of those bookstore windows. These students had invited Weber to give the talk in the hopes that he would make sense of their situation, as bleak and desperate as it was, and lend credibility to their aspirations to remake the political order in their image. 1919 is a really fraught political time, a real kind of crucible in global politics. So when I say left-leaning, that means something. Really, I mean, think about 1918 and what that means for like left-leaning global politics. So, and think about like the disaffected, defeated young men who are wanting to push German politics in their direction. As one interpreter puts it, Weber was reluctant even to give the lecture because he thought these students lacked, and here's a quote, any sense of what political maturity in the present or foreseeable situation might be, end quote. He took it as his task then to, quote unquote, disillusion them. Because, as he told them, they would find neither easy answers nor favorable resolutions to the current crisis in which they found themselves. The students wanted Weber to give them hope or affirmation for their aspirations in the midst of their darkness. Weber's gift to them was instead disillusionment. You can tell that this is going to be an exciting time for the next few minutes. Weber wasn't a Christian. He famously described himself as religiously unmusical, which I really like. I like that as a description. As someone who myself is not musical, I like to describe myself as musically unmusical in a good Weberian way. But when Weber responded to their darkness by insisting on disillusioning them, he was picking up on a Christian approach to politics that goes back at least to St. Augustine. Weber concluded his lecture on that cold German night in 1919. It's like almost cold by Texas standards this morning, right? With a final word about the nature of political work itself. Political work isn't the work of remaking the world in your image, like these young left-leaning students wanted to do. It isn't to solve all of the problems of evil and misery for all time. And problems of evil and misery were very evident to them. That is the temptation of tyrants and utopians, which are very often the same thing. Real politics, Weber concludes, very famous line, is the slow and difficult drilling of holes into hard boards, the boring of holes into hard boards. I really love this line. It's a famous line in political philosophy, political theory. But the reason that I love it is that Weber leaves it just like that. When we think about like if you want to drill at home and you're like drilling into something, you do it for a purpose. It's because you want to build something, right? Weber doesn't tell us any of that. It's just the drilling of the holes into boards that are themselves hard and impenetrable. Just do it over and over and over and over. That's politics for Weber. I concluded last week's lecture by referencing Weber's Politics as a Vocation, which is the lecture that I just described to you. I pick it up tonight in order to highlight the realism that is the framework of his argument. It was only by disillusioning, that's what he set out to do according to these interpreters, right? And he ends with this description of politics as just the boring of holes into hard boards. It was only by disillusioning his audience that he could give them a portrait of a politician who has a vocation to politics. So, recalling from last week, the central concept that Weber uses for describing that politician is what he calls an ethics of responsibility, that he contrasts to an ethics of ultimate ends. Last week, I glossed that idea of responsibility by explaining the way that you can think of responsibility in kind of three ways, three overtones or undertones of the idea of responsibility. First, as a response to a call. So someone calls and you respond. That's a responsibility. You respond to the call, and that's where you get the idea of the term vocation. So politics as a vocation is to respond to a call. And it's deeply religious. It traces especially back to kind of Luther. So that idea of vocation is deeply Christian. The second sort of version of responsibility is as a burden to be shouldered. So when it is when something needs to be arranged, like a lecture in a parish hall, you take the responsibility for putting it together, right? That's the other thing. And then third, and that's often very often on behalf of others. So you are taking responsibility for something for others. And that's what politics is, to bear the burdens, the common burdens of the people on behalf of the people. And then third, the idea of responsibility as accountability, or really importantly, even to be found guilty. So the example that I use, like when the parents go away on holiday and they come back and there's like very obviously been a keg party, right? There are empty kegs all around, broken glasses, the house is destroyed, there's no one in sight, but everything is just absolutely smashed, and they stand at the foot of the stairs and they yell loudly, "Who's responsible for this?" That's a rhetorical question, right? It's you are the one, right? So that's to be held responsible, and each one of these can be related to the other. So you are called to serve, you shoulder the burden of service, but if you are a genuinely responsible figure, then you are willing to be held to account for the decisions that you make in the exercise of your responsibility. So you could say, look, you all called me here to give this lecture. The fact that I really did a terrible job is on you. I showed up, I did it, I executed, to hell with the results, right? No, to be responsible is if you are the person, even if you're called, if you respond to the call, if you shoulder the burden, then to be genuinely responsible, you have to be willing to be held to account for what you've done, even, and this is where it's tricky, when what you've done is only what you could do based on the information that you had at hand. It could have been right or it could have been wrong, and you don't know. That's really weighty. So paradigmatically, to send people into war is something you have to be willing to take ownership of if you're the person who is the commander-in-chief, right? If that's your responsibility. For Weber, in his German context, it really is a politician exclusively who has this vocation. Or perhaps better put, there are those who are called to be politicians, and they are the ones who bear these burdens of responsibility. My hope in this set of lectures, and especially tonight, is to show how a version of this understanding of responsibility has a natural home in the American context, where it is all of us, and not only a select few, those who are chosen by God, or providence, or luck, or the ballot, or birthright, or charisma, or whatever, not just those select few who happen to find their way into those positions, but all of us who are to be responsible in all of those ways. And this is what I meant last week when I said that there is a tradition of civic virtue, and that responsibility is a way of categorizing all of those sorts of things that are required for a republic to work. If you take them all and you sort of categorize them, the sort of controlling language that you could use would be responsibility. The central figure in the American context who brings this language of responsibility into American life as a way of helping explain what America is to itself is the mid-20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, Niebuhr is an interesting figure, and if you've never heard of him, you can certainly be forgiven, but if you had been a reader of, say, Time magazine in the mid-20th century, you would absolutely know who Niebuhr is. He graced the cover of Time magazine on its 25th anniversary issue. He's the most influential theologian in the American context for many, many years. But he started just as a pastor of a pretty much German sort of expat community in Detroit. Very early on, he was deeply influenced by kind of Marxism and the social gospel. If you're interested in any of these things, we can talk about them as historical phenomena later. Because of his German background, he had access to the European sort of scene much earlier than most of the Americans did, especially in the interwar period. And he became very critical of the ascent of Hitler to power. It was in that context that he was actually invited to give the most prestigious set of lectures in religious studies in the world. They're called the Gifford Lectures, and he gave them in Edinburgh in 1939. And while he was giving the lectures, he was actually concerned. So it was like a big sweeping auditorium, right? And he was concerned the audience was actually like bored by what he was saying because they weren't really looking at him. You're all very attentive, thank you. But they were all looking out, like paying attention and sort of like taken aback. And he thought that he was like losing his audience. But it was because they could hear Nazi bombers bombing the harbor just over the horizon from them. They could hear them flying over. So Niebuhr was so engrossed in what he was saying. And what he was saying was, politicians tend to arrogate to themselves the role of God. This is the sort of role that they take for themselves. And it's our duty as humans to neither abdicate our responsibilities as political people, nor to arrogate to ourselves in a pretentious sort of way what is God's duty. And so while Niebuhr is diagnosing the actual ills of the Western world, he's so engrossed in what he's saying that he doesn't realize that what he's saying has enough purchase to describe what the audience is hearing, like zooming overhead by them, right? That's what's distracting them, is the reality of what he's describing. So Niebuhr is a sort of a forceful advocate for what becomes a position called Christian realism, which seeks to balance power against power, to take into account like the self-interest of humans and nations and groups, and to think about this at a sort of global scale. But he also becomes the most important articulator of what it means for America to assume an international status as a leader in the world, as a global power in the wake of the Second World War, in a book called The Irony of American History, which is a classic, and I really do commend it to you. It's a fantastic book, and if you have sort of just an interest in American mid-century life, you may have to wade through it a little bit, but you get yourself in a volume that has a good introduction. I think that it will interest you. I'm going to read you just a brief couple of descriptions of Niebuhr's project, especially in that irony of American history. So you need to think about the fact that America had been mostly isolationist. It had been late to the First World War. It exists as what amounts to an island. I mean, we are not actually an island, but we're buttressed from all of the other world's powers on both sides, right? And this existed for all of America's like time. And so it had the idea that it was, in Niebuhr's like way of describing it, like morally superior to the old country. We didn't have to worry about being embroiled in France's politics or Germany's politics or Russia or whatever the case is. We could just do our own thing and we could pride ourselves on our moral innocency. And all of that came to an immediate halt in 1945. And then it became a question of how it was that we were going to exercise our authority when we had no training in how to do it. So my dissertation advisor is a guy named Robin Lovin. He's been giving lectures and working occasionally with people in China, and has for many years worked with people in Russia. And he's fond of saying that for the Chinese, 1600 years is recent history. That's how their traditions work, right? For us, like if you want to go to the Fort Worth stockyards and see like ancient history, you can do that. And that's like yesterday for most of the world's superpowers, right? And so America all of a sudden ascends to the world stage with all of this like superior power and has no training in how to exercise it as a global community or in a global community. And Niebuhr is trying to diagnose that situation. So I'm going to read you I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here. So you bear with me. This is somebody else's work on Niebuhr, but I think it will help describe what's going on. Niebuhr's appreciation of Madison, so the president, right, founding father, was second only to his appreciation of Abraham Lincoln. Madison diagnosed history. Lincoln, for Niebuhr, modeled a Christian politics that could save it. Niebuhr regularly invokes Lincoln's second inaugural address as the archetype of Christian politics. Niebuhr signaled Lincoln's importance to his theology of history by closing the irony of American history with an analysis of the famous speech. Niebuhr's theology was neither a blind nor otherworldly walk by faith. He offered a practical theology for realization in history. Three of the world's most important historical figures, one analyzed by Niebuhr and the other two influenced by him, demonstrate the applicability of his Christian perspective. Abraham Lincoln's theologically rich second inaugural has become uniformly recognized as one of the greatest speeches ever delivered on American soil. Its greatness, as Niebuhr argued, owes to Lincoln's insistence on shared guilt. It's one people who share the guilt together, not just the South, not just the North, but a shared sense of responsibility for what they've brought about. And shared charity, with malice towards none, to bind up the nation's wounds. These traits animated Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. as well. And Niebuhr figured prominently in their respective defiance of Nazism and American apartheid. Niebuhr exposed both overt and covert expressions of racism that typified post-Second World War America. And he disputed 1950s unqualified faith in capitalism, science, and reason, especially the tendency to view these endeavors as leading automatically towards progress. These contributions place Niebuhr in the pantheon of the nation's best and most critical minds and distinguish him as the most important American intellectual of the 20th century. So that's all from this other scholar. In this description, what you get is Niebuhr interpreting the American scene, going back to Lincoln as the sort of archetype for the exercise of responsibility. So it's Niebuhr who actually takes the language of responsibility from its German context and embeds it in the American context. Niebuhr is known especially for the terms like realism and responsibility. And his idea of responsibility is one that takes that account that I was describing from Weber and locates it in the American context that says this is not just the special burden that single politicians bear for all of us, but the burdens that we bear by virtue of our citizenship. And like Lincoln, in his context as the burden bearer of the country itself, we are to exercise responsibility in that way in our own lives. But this requires us to be willing to risk political action without understanding or without knowing or without being able to control its consequences. You can consider the proximate consequences that you know will happen. If you send people into war, you know that some people will die. but you don't know what the outcome of the war is. You don't know what unintended consequences might occur from it. You might incite violence in this other community. You might, your victory in today's war might actually bring about tomorrow's terrorists. You don't know what the unintended consequences of your action are. That's exactly why they are unintended. But you have to be willing to be held accountable for them. You can't command people into war. I don't think any of you can, right? But you do have to undertake actions in politics, in the life of the country, that you cannot control. That's what voting is. When you go to the ballot box in November, you're going to be acting responsibly. You're going to be exercising the authority of citizenship, and you cannot control its outcomes. And even if you get what you want, it won't be perfect. And if you get what you want, then you are in some way responsible for what that person does. But here's the real rub. If you're a citizen, you are in some way responsible for what that person does, even if you don't vote for him or her. Because we act collectively, we act together. And so any action whatsoever is morally risky. And you have to be willing to risk acting and to bear the burdens of your action. That's what Lincoln does. That's what he provides a paradigm for. That's the sort of version of Lincoln that you get through Reinhold Niebuhr. And the person who's most known, the most famous person that Niebuhr really influences, is actually Martin Luther King Jr. And Niebuhr is known for his willingness to think about the exercise of military, the use of military might to pursue political ends, these sorts of things, which runs counter to King, who is an avowed pacifist. But if you read King's letter from a Birmingham jail, you can see, or you just read anything by King, you can see that what he does is describe the way that those who hold power will not just give it up, they have to be forced, they have to be compelled to do so. Those who exercise power wrongly will not, just because they think of themselves as virtuous, do the right thing. That's the Madisonian influence. You have to be willing to balance power with power. Those who do not have power have to join together to force those who are exercising it unjustly to conform to justice. And King does this over and over and over. So think about his most famous work, the bus boycott. In that community, it was the Black community that most needed public transit, that used it the most to get to their jobs. And when King organizes, when he heads up this action, what he does is tell them, we're not going to use public transit anymore, and this is going to deprive all of these other people on the other side of town of their service workers. And that is going to force them to conform to justice. But you know what it does to the Black community? It exacerbates their suffering because they can't get to their jobs. And they have to join together to create carpools that drive from one side of town to the other. But do you know what you do if you're running a carpool and you've already been working a long day of manual labor at hard work in the South in the summer? You skip dinner, you skip time with your family, and you drive people back and forth to their jobs, to their homes. In other words, for one full year, King demanded that the people who were already bearing the worst of the burden bear more of it. And they were successful. And do you know what they got for it? Absolute justice, civil rights, voting rights, the end of segregation, the end of racism. No, they didn't get any of those things. They got a better seat on a bus. This is how you wage a war. This is how you wage a just war. You identify the wrong that is being done and you say, we're going to prosecute this action until you give up this. And then we'll stop. And King was good on his word. Every single time they stopped, he stopped. And eventually, he just kept doing it over and over and over. And all of those things that I just said, I mean, maybe not the end of racism, but certainly like the voting rights, all this sort of stuff, that was the culmination of all of these different actions. When King finally died, he was deeply unpopular. And he wasn't just unpopular with racist white people in the South. He was deeply unpopular in the Black community. And one reason is because he had required this level of burden bearing over and over and over and over. And that's what it means to be responsible, to act that way. Now, your vote may not be that in a few weeks. To be a real citizen is to realize that you can't achieve everything, to be disillusioned in that Weberian sense, and then to still have the fortitude to say, you know what? I'm going to join together with other people and pursue what justice I can, realizing that even that isn't total justice. It's just worth it. And so I'll stop there because I'm already at time. Thank you very much.
We've got time for a few questions. If we have any, I'll check to see if anybody's offering anything online. Yes.
So you talk about the collective and about justice. I think today it seems like the idea of justice is there are two different sets of what justice is and what people think, and the divisiveness. I just, that working with the whole community is part of that.
Yeah, I think this is, it's a very helpful question. I think this is one thing that I'm trying to sort of push out with this, is that if we actually accept the limitations of our political actions, we can pursue them a bit more freely. You can't fix history, but you can keep it going. Something like that. So, yeah, it's true that if you vote for a Republican, a Democrat can lose, or if you vote for a Democrat, a Republican can lose, or whatever, you can lose, right? Like, and so it's kind of a zero-sum way there. But engaging in that as an act of identifying with this community that collectively acts is itself an act of responsibility, which is sometimes cold comfort, because we look around and we're like, well, that community seems to be backing away from justice rather than conforming to it, or something like that. But the task of a citizen is not to reshape the republic in your own image. It's to bear the burden of the republic together with all of the other citizens. And I think that that's a lot less romantic, which is why I started with this whole idea of disillusionment, right? Just like the young Germans couldn't fix Germany and remold it into their image in the wake of its destruction. Not just like that, but in a similar way, we can't make the country in our image every 2 to 4 years. what we can do is conform ourselves to the better angels of our natures as a country, something like that. And there's this line in my lecture, it's buried in there. It sounds a lot. I'm always concerned in these situations. I'm teaching Sunday school at my church, just on Christian faith and politics, basically, like same sort of like contextual thing this semester, right? And I'm always concerned that by just describing these sorts of things, that people are wondering, what does this have to do with my faithfulness as a Christian? But what I'm arguing is that this is, if not the Christian way of thinking about politics, it's at least one of the most influential ways that Christians have thought about politics, going back at least to St. Augustine. That it's not our job to make sure that history turns out right. Only God can do that, and only tyrants try here below. It's our job to keep history going in just the history that God has given to us providentially. You're not responsible for 1860 or 1863. You're not responsible for 1944. You're not even responsible for 2025. You're just responsible for what you have in front of you right now. And to take that really seriously as something that is given to you both as a right and as a duty, to use the language I used a couple of weeks ago, I think that requires a kind of confidence in God that Christianity really does inculcate, to accept the world that God has given you and to act in it as God has given you to act in it. Or, less prosaically, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. That's my best answer, right? Neither party will actually bring about justice. And that's really disheartening. On the other hand, the only parties that claim to bring about justice are the ones you don't want anything to do with. Yeah.
But that's where you get into issue advocacy. I mean,
yeah.
You can't just vote once every 2 years or 4 years or whatever and then say, okay, I'm through now.
Yeah, so I ran out of time. But that's the
that's number 4.
Yeah, so this is the thing that you get in Niebuhr earlier, is his earlier book, one of his earlier books is called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And it's a little more stark, but basically he thinks, look, humans on the whole want to be virtuous. They want to be like moral, right? But as soon as they join themselves to other groups, as soon as they join in order to create groups, they overestimate the virtue of their position. And they are inescapably immoral. I think Niebuhr becomes more sophisticated. It goes along to realize on their own, humans aren't that great either, which maybe accounts for why when they join together, like it's not just their angels that come with them, but their demons as well. But the idea is that we are always more prone to overestimate our virtue and to overestimate our opponent's vices than we are to do the inverse. And that should not stop us from joining together to pursue justice, issue advocacy, or whatever. It just means that we should think carefully about how we overstate the congruence between our issue advocacy and God's position. You may be absolutely for a raise in the minimum wage, and God may be on the side of the oppressed. But that does not mean, as tempting as it is to conclude, that God is also on the side of a certain minimum wage. It means that you are, and you have to be willing to be found right or wrong about that, not just to plead your innocency as an advocate. Does that make sense? So that's the idea, that responsibility requires us to be responsible in our group activities, even though, or even especially because, it's only by joining together in groups that we can pursue collective action, which is sort of my idea. That was what I was implicitly gesturing at with King, right? What if King had been wrong?
Right.
What if it's wrong to make the suffering suffer more? for a better seat on a bus. I'll be honest with you. If I just describe it that way, that's what it sounds like to me. Look, you all are impoverished and suffering and hurting and oppressed. And what I want from you is for you to give up the one way that you have of getting to your jobs for the next year. And you know what you'll get in advance? Like, for all that work? A better seat on that bus next year. You're like, that's the dumbest proposition I've ever heard, right? And so you have to be willing not to overestimate the virtue of your position, even if you are absolutely committed to it. And it may take the absolute commitment up to it in order to achieve that. And so that give and take, this goes all the way back to the first thing I said here on the first night. Christian thinking about politics is always thinking about the authorization for politics and the relativization of all politics, the give and take. What gives it its grounding, what it holds it as something that we can entrust ourselves to, and what means that we should be suspicious of it. So.
I don't know if this is a question or a thought. The examples that you're giving, which I totally agree with, and I agree with everything you said, I don't want to sound negative. But none of those examples are what you and I would perceive as current history. Meaning, we're talking about Lincoln, we're talking about other folks, but current history being, let's say, from Obama forward.
Okay.
And what has been influencing the masses, even beyond the ponds that we are protected by, is our own, well, basically media, and media content and social media. How would Abraham Lincoln have dealt with a second round in a civil war with CNN on his back?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really good question. It's well beyond my sort of like scope of how Christians should think about politics, right? But it's a good one. And I think that it's one that is, if anything, even though people talk about it quite a bit, underestimated. I don't think you can overestimate the change, the influence of the change in media over the past 20 years, let's say. My first impulse is to say that what it does is require us to be even more discerning in our attempt to know what it is, what the right is. So with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Lincoln doesn't think that God gives him to see the right all the way to the end of the war. In fact, it is at the end of the war, and he's still saying earlier in the speech, the progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is reasonably successful, as well known to you as it is to me, which is not true. He knows more than they do, but it's also like everybody knows they've won Georgia or Atlanta. It's like going pretty well, right? So it's at the very end, and he's still saying, I can't predict history. Not even this history, not like yesterday's history, right? Very recent history. But the fact that we have constant sort of facts coming at us and constant opinions and just a sort of deluge of information, I think requires us to be even more discerning in what it is that we say that God is giving us to see. And that's an unsatisfactory answer or response to your question. It's not an answer at all. It's just one that says, in a world that is attempting to speed up, it may be virtuous to slow down. Like, yeah, sure. I've exhausted my knowledge.
I taught AP art history in high school and from Paleolithic to modern times. And I think what I came away with from Neolithic times, the minute we started banding together, coming together as a community, mankind has always struggled for power, resources, religion. And so in a meta view of humanity, we are not so different. You know, we are dealing with the same issues. And you can look at the political maps through time and you can see everything always changing. I think that the changes, you know, from the printing press to the computer to social media, all of those kind of things do. It's like trying to start a fire with a magnifying glass, right? It feels super intense. And, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but I think humans have been kind of operating this way.
I mean, it could very well be that 3,000 years from now, people look back at our time and see it as just as odd as that time. But in the terms of what it means to be the American Republic, like the American experiment, I do think that the last 20 years reflect a kind of, at least an acceleration of challenges that are unprecedented in 1860 or whatever the case is. Sorry.
No, that's great. I mean, that fits with what you were saying about Niebuhr's work in Immoral Men and in society, right? Like the one of the questions online actually is, did the concept of racism and suppression come from the U.S. to Germany? And I mean, I'd be curious to have your additions to this, but it's like, no, I mean, racism and suppression have been around since people have banded together, right? And we're excluding the outsider because they're dangerous.
That tribe for barbarian.
Right.
Yeah,
It's changed over time.
Yeah, that's a really complex question because it depends on what you mean by the term racism. And I'm not trying to evade here. It really doesn't mean
fair.
like, you know, if you're trying to give a scientific explanation for the races, in one way you could say it actually originates in, if not Germany itself, at least that intellectual milieu in the late 19th century when you're trying to categorize humans in the same way that you categorize other creatures, right? And so you're looking at different physical traits and trying to characterize people in relation to other versions of the creatures who have those same traits. And so that gets worked out into, you basically are blending a kind of observational, empirical, natural science with something like the emerging discipline of sociology, where you can talk about groups and you say, all right, the groups that behave this way also happen to look this way, and we think they're inferior, right? So it's a quasi-scientific way of classifying, and then that gets worked out politically. But clearly, the idea that you could just like take people from different outgroups or whatever and call them your own, that existed long before. And it existed not just with people who wanted to enslave people who had darker skin than them or whatever, right? Like you could defeat a people, and because they were your enemy, take them as slaves. That was just normal. So yeah, that's a complex question, I think, historically.
We'll do one more and then we'll close with a prayer.
A great top down. Thanks for doing this. That last point is interesting because what you made me think is that about 10 years ago, they did a study of the most cited person in the last 400 years, or most influential, and you think it's maybe some religious character or something like that, or whatever. It's actually Linnaeus, the guy who came up with the classification system of biological differentiation.
Oh, interesting.
Who's been more quoted than Jesus Christ, believe it or not, in terms of the difference of classification of biological specimens to human beings and the reason.
Interesting.
Maybe one more on a cheery note and
This is actually
just terrible.
This is my colleague. This is my colleague who I texted earlier and was like, hey, do you want to come with me? And he shows up to end the night like this. So you're not welcome back next week.
He's been here before. Free.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. We're super grateful for this. The knowledge, the wisdom, and all that you bring, and your capacity to kind of characterize it the way that you have. So thank you for being here. I'm going to offer us a prayer, and then as we can linger as you'd like. So the Lord be with you. Also with you. Let us pray. Lord, we give you thanks for this time together, for this place, all who gather here. Open our hearts and minds to hear your guidance as we gather. Prayer from one another, from the scriptures, through our community, that this may help us to discern those things that you're calling us to, that we may be Christ to the world, exhibiting your love, your grace, and your mercy above all. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Thanks again.
It's a pleasure to be with you all.
We're delighted to have you. Gonna sign off over here. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks to the online people.
Yeah, thanks.
That's right. There